The story of the Heinkel He-162 begins in the desperate twilight of the Third Reich. By 1944, Germany's once formidable Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Allied strategic bombing had crippled industry and infrastructure, while the skies over Europe were dominated by ever-increasing numbers of American B-17s, B-24s, and British Lancasters, escorted by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang. The German leadership, facing overwhelming losses, sought radical solutions to restore air superiority. It was in this atmosphere of urgency, bordering on panic, that the concept of a so-called Volksjäger, the people's fighter, emerged. The demand was simple in outline but nearly impossible in execution. The Reich Air Ministry ordered German manufacturers to design and deliver a jet fighter that could be mass-produced quickly, cheaply, and flown by minimally trained pilots, including Hitler Youth. The aircraft was intended to be a last-ditch weapon, flown by the young or inexperienced to intercept Allied bombers in the final stages of the war. The requirements placed immense emphasis on speed of development and simplicity of construction, often at the expense of durability and safety. Wood was to replace scarce aluminum, components had to be fabricated by semi-skilled labor, and the design had to be light enough for rapid assembly in dispersed workshops. Heinkel, already experienced with jet aircraft through its work on the He-280 and the early jet bomber He-178, moved aggressively to secure the contract. The company's design team, under Siegfried Günther, responded with the He-162, a compact, sleek fighter powered by a single BMW 003 turbojet engine mounted above the fuselage. The unconventional placement of the engine solved several design challenges. It kept the fuselage slim, allowed for shorter air intakes, and simplified the overall structure. Yet it also introduced aerodynamic risks and complicated maintenance. Still, the Heinkel proposal impressed the Air Ministry. On September 25, 1944, the design was officially accepted, with an extraordinary demand. A flying prototype had to be produced within just 3 months. The development timetable bordered on the impossible. Even in the best conditions, aircraft typically required years of design, prototyping, and refinement. Here, Heinkel engineers had less than 90 days to take a sketch and turn it into an operational jet fighter. To achieve this, compromises were inevitable. The fuselage was largely constructed of wood to save precious metal. The wings, too, were built from plywood, bonded with adhesives that were often of inconsistent quality due to material shortages. The cockpit was stripped down to essentials, with minimal instrumentation and protection. Yet despite these constraints, Heinkel pressed forward, determined to deliver what the regime demanded. By December 1944, the first prototype, designated He-162V1, was ready for flight testing. Its appearance was striking, a small, almost fragile airframe, with the engine perched on its back like an ungainly hump, a high-mounted tailplane, and sharply tapered wings. Nicknamed Salamander by its designers, the aircraft looked both futuristic and precarious. To the outside observer, it symbolized the strange paradox of late-war German engineering. Brilliant innovation constrained by dire necessity and chronic shortages. As the Allied noose tightened around the Reich, the He-162 became less a rational military program and more a desperate gamble, born of a nation unwilling to admit defeat. The Heinkel He-162 entered its testing phase under extraordinary conditions, with engineers, pilots, and military overseers working against an unforgiving deadline. On December 6, 1944, the first prototype took to the air at Schwechat near Vienna. It was a remarkable achievement to have produced a functioning jet fighter in under 90 days, but this speed came at a steep price. Within minutes of its maiden flight, structural flaws became apparent. The adhesives binding the wooden components, weakened by poor substitutes and rushed assembly, failed under stress. During subsequent test runs, one prototype disintegrated in mid-air, killing the test pilot. Investigations traced the accident to bonding failures in the wing structure, a direct result of inferior glues and the chaotic conditions of wartime production. Despite these setbacks, the program continued at full speed. Heinkel engineers attempted to reinforce the wings and refine the adhesives, but shortages of quality materials meant compromises had to be accepted. The aircraft itself was fast. In clean conditions, it could reach speeds in excess of 800 kilometers per hour, making it one of the fastest jets of the war. Its compact size and relatively light weight gave it a high rate of climb, allowing it to reach bomber formations quickly. On paper, the He-162 appeared to meet the specifications laid out by the Air Ministry. In practice, however, it was dangerously unstable. The high-mounted turbojet altered the center of gravity, making the fighter sensitive to pilot input. Small errors in control could result in stalls or spins, particularly for inexperienced aviators. Pilots involved in the early trials reported a mixed experience. The He-162 was agile at high speed, with excellent roll rate and responsiveness, but it was unforgiving at low speeds or during takeoff and landing. The tricycle landing gear, meant to simplify handling, often failed on rough airstrips, and the narrow track made ground handling precarious. Several prototypes crashed during routine flights, further tarnishing the aircraft's reputation among experienced Luftwaffe personnel. Even so, the Reich's leadership pushed forward, unwilling to slow the program. By January 1945, production orders were already underway, even before comprehensive testing was complete. The BMW 003 engine, which powered the He-162, posed its own challenges. Although compact and relatively lightweight, it was prone to flameouts and required meticulous maintenance. Positioned above the fuselage, the engine was easy to replace in theory, but in practice, mechanics struggled with access in field conditions. Moreover, engine reliability suffered due to poor quality metals and rushed assembly. Failures were common, and pilots often faced sudden power losses mid-flight. Yet, under pressure from the Air Ministry, these problems were downplayed, as the priority was quantity over quality. Test flights highlighted further problems with the aircraft's design philosophy. The cockpit, intended for young or barely trained pilots, was cramped and lacked many instruments necessary for situational awareness. The ejection seat, one of the first operationally fitted in a fighter, was a notable innovation, but it was more a reflection of necessity than luxury, given the number of test crashes. Even with these additions, survival rates among test pilots remained low, as many were unable to control the aircraft during critical moments. The He-162 earned a reputation as a jet that could kill its own pilot as easily as an enemy bomber. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe faced a paradox. On one hand, the He-162 represented an impressive technical feat, built in record time under impossible conditions. On the other, it was riddled with flaws that made it unsuitable as a mass-production fighter. Nevertheless, the Reich's propaganda machinery portrayed the He-162 as a symbol of resilience, promising a revolutionary weapon that would turn the tide of the war. In reality, the rushed testing period revealed more problems than solutions, but the program pressed on regardless. With the front collapsing on all sides, the He-162 was moved from prototype to production with unprecedented haste, setting the stage for its troubled operational debut. By the opening months of 1945, the Heinkel He-162 was pushed into frontline service despite its incomplete development and troubling safety record. The Luftwaffe, desperate for any means to contest Allied dominance in the skies, ordered the formation of new fighter units to operate the jet. One of the first squadrons was IJG-1, stationed at Lech in northern Germany. This unit was tasked with introducing the Volksjäger into combat while simultaneously training pilots to master the volatile aircraft. It was a daunting mission, as the majority of available aviators were either inexperienced youth or veterans exhausted from years of war. The He-162's entry into service was rushed, with many pilots having only a handful of hours in piston engine trainers before being sent to fly jets. The idea that teenagers or minimally trained men could manage a high-performance jet was more propaganda than reality. In practice, those assigned to the He-162 were often seasoned flyers drawn from surviving Luftwaffe units, chosen for their ability to handle its dangerous quirks. Training flights revealed the same issues uncovered during testing. The aircraft was fast and agile at altitude, but extremely unforgiving at low speed. Numerous accidents occurred during takeoff or landing, often fatal. The narrow undercarriage and lightweight construction made the He-162 prone to veering off runways or collapsing under stress. Losses due to non-combat incidents mounted rapidly, undermining morale and wasting valuable machines. Despite these hazards, the He-162 was introduced to the battlefield in April 1945. Its speed allowed it to surprise Allied fighters and bombers, but the short endurance of its BMW 003 engine providing barely 30 minutes of flight time, severely limited its operational value. Missions often had to be launched only when Allied formations were already within range, giving little margin for error. Pilots reported frustration at being forced to choose between intercepting enemy aircraft and conserving fuel for a safe return. In many cases, sorties ended prematurely with forced landings in fields or crashes near airfields, further depleting Germany's dwindling pool of trained aviators. Allied intelligence by this stage was well aware of the He-162. Downed wrecks and reconnaissance photographs revealed its unusual configuration, and captured documents outlined the Luftwaffe's ambition to produce thousands of units. In reality, only a few hundred were completed, many never leaving storage facilities or makeshift assembly halls. Of those that reached combat units, mechanical failures and shortages of spare parts meant that only a fraction were ever airworthy at any given time. The vision of swarms of People's fighters overwhelming Allied bombers never came close to materializing. The Luftwaffe command recognized these limitations, but political pressure from the Reich leadership forced them to persist. Adolf Hitler himself had been captivated by the promise of jet aircraft and believed they could change the outcome of the war. Heinkel's engineers and Luftwaffe officers were thus compelled to deliver results, even when it was clear that the He-162 could not fulfill its intended role. By spring 1945, the jets were flying combat patrols, but their impact was negligible compared to the overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft. P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires dominated the skies, and even when the He-162 engaged, it rarely achieved kills before technical problems or limited fuel forced disengagement. For the pilots of JG-1, the experience was one of frustration and tragedy. A few claimed successful engagements against Allied reconnaissance aircraft or fighters, but the majority of losses came not from enemy action but from accidents. The combination of rushed production, unreliable engines, and insufficient training created a cycle where new pilots were lost almost as quickly as they were assigned. Each crash underscored the grim reality that the He-162 was more a symbol of desperation than an effective weapon. Still, until the collapse of the Reich in May 1945, units continued to field the aircraft, attempting to extract some tactical value from what was ultimately a failed experiment in mass-produced jet warfare. Combat deployment of the He-162 in April and May 1945 revealed the stark contrast between its theoretical capabilities and its actual battlefield performance. In theory, the jet offered the Luftwaffe a high-speed interceptor capable of challenging Allied fighters and harassing bomber formations. In practice, the realities of late-war Germany left it crippled before it could achieve meaningful results. The aircraft's combat record, while including a handful of successes, was dominated by mechanical failures, accidents, and the overwhelming superiority of the Allied air forces. Reports from JG-1, the primary operational unit equipped with the He-162, show that while the jet was fast enough to evade or surprise opponents, its limited fuel supply and fragile construction severely hampered missions. With endurance often no greater than 30 minutes, pilots had to carefully time takeoffs to coincide with enemy raids already approaching German territory. This meant they were constantly fighting against the clock. Any prolonged dogfight or extended pursuit was impossible. Pilots often had to disengage after a brief encounter, racing back to base before their tanks ran dry. Allied pilots quickly learned to exploit this weakness, shadowing the He-162 until it was forced to retreat, and then striking as it attempted to land. Those few encounters that did result in air-to-air kills highlighted the potential locked within the design. The jet's speed and roll rate allowed for sharp, high-speed attacks, especially against unsuspecting reconnaissance aircraft or lone fighters. In one documented case, an She-162 pilot downed a Royal Air Force fighter during a brief interception, demonstrating the danger the jet could pose under favorable conditions. However, such victories were rare, overshadowed by the heavy toll of accidents. More pilots died from structural failures, crashes, or engine malfunctions than from combat. The tricycle undercarriage proved fragile on makeshift airstrips, while the BMW 003 engine was prone to flameouts and sudden loss of thrust. Each operational sortie risked catastrophic failure, even if no enemy aircraft were encountered. Tactically, the He-162 was also unsuited to the strategic needs of the Luftwaffe in 1945. The Allied bombing campaign was conducted with large formations of heavy bombers escorted by experienced fighter groups. To counter this, Germany required durable, heavily armed jets capable of sustaining attacks against mass bombers. The Me-262, though also plagued by shortages and reliability issues, at least offered heavier armament and greater range. The He-162, by contrast, carried only two 20 mm MG 151-20 cannons, adequate for engaging single fighters but insufficient for downing heavy bombers in formation. Its lightweight frame limited the potential for upgrades, and attempts to fit larger guns risked compromising the already delicate balance of the design. Thus, in actual combat, the Volksjäger failed to provide a meaningful answer to the bomber threat it was built to counter. Within the ranks of the Luftwaffe, morale surrounding the He-162 was mixed. Veteran pilots respected its speed but distrusted its fragility. Many regarded it as a political project forced upon them rather than a genuine solution. Younger pilots, particularly those rushed through training, struggled to master its dangerous handling characteristics, leading to high attrition before they could even face the enemy. For ground crews, the aircraft presented constant challenges. Spare parts were scarce, materials inconsistent, and repair work made more difficult by the unconventional engine placement. Even simple maintenance tasks consumed precious time, further reducing the number of operational jets available on any given day. Allied forces, for their part, quickly recognized the He-162 as another symbol of Germany's technological ingenuity constrained by desperation. When captured intact after the war, Allied test pilots confirmed both its impressive speed and its alarming instability. They noted that, under controlled conditions, it could perform as a competent interceptor, but its limited endurance and fragility rendered it unsuited for the sustained, large-scale air campaigns that defined late World War II. In the end, the He-162's combat role amounted to little more than a series of short-lived trials fought in the dying days of the Third Reich, where its impact was negligible compared to the overwhelming Allied dominance in the air. As production continued into the spring of 1945, the He-162 began to evolve into several planned variants, though most never advanced beyond the prototype stage before Germany's surrender. Engineers within Heinkel recognized the inherent flaws of the basic design and sought to improve stability, armament, and endurance. However, the collapse of the Reich meant that these ambitions remained largely theoretical. Still, the records of these projects provide insight into how the He-162 might have developed under less desperate conditions. One of the most notable planned modifications was the He-162A2, which became the main production model. This version carried two 20mm MG 151-20 cannons, lighter than the heavier 30mm Mk 108s that had been considered but deemed unsuitable due to recoil and weight. The A2 represented the standard configuration deployed by JG-1, though even this model was subject to ongoing tweaks. Engineers envisioned a further upgrade, the He-162A3, that would incorporate 30mm cannons, but structural concerns about the fragile wooden wings meant this design remained on the drawing board. The emphasis consistently returned to weight reduction, as the jet's small size left little margin for heavy weapons or equipment. Another proposed development was the He-162B series, which would have featured improved aerodynamics and, in some proposals, a more powerful Heinkel GS011 turbojet. This engine, had it been available, promised greater thrust and reliability than the troubled BMW 003, potentially solving some of the endurance problems that plagued the operational aircraft. However, shortages of materials and the disarray of the German aviation industry ensured that such upgrades never left the prototype stage. By April 1945, production facilities were already being overrun or destroyed by advancing Allied forces, halting any long-term development. Specialized variants were also considered. A two-seat trainer version, the He-162S, was built in limited numbers. Recognizing the high attrition rate among inexperienced pilots, Luftwaffe Command approved this trainer to ease the transition to jet flight. The He-162S had its engine removed and a glider configuration, allowing instructors to give student pilots basic handling experience without risking scarce turbojets. Yet even this solution was of little use in practice, as the Luftwaffe no longer had the luxury of extended pilot training. The idea of Hitler Youth recruits mastering the jet in combat proved nothing more than propaganda. with the trainer remaining a curiosity rather than a viable tool. Other proposals range from reconnaissance versions to models equipped with rocket boosters for rapid climbs. Some designs envisioned using the He-162 as a parasite fighter, launched from larger aircraft to ambush Allied bombers. Still others proposed adapting it into a jet-powered night fighter, though its limited endurance and small airframe made such roles impractical. These concepts highlight the inventive spirit of German engineers, but also the unreality of late-war aviation planning. With resources exhausted and defeat imminent, there was no path to transform the He-162 into a mature weapon system. The collapse of German industry in April and May 1945 meant that most of these variants remained unfinished. Production records suggest that approximately 320 He-162s were completed, though only a fraction became operational. Many airframes were abandoned at assembly sites or destroyed before they could be delivered. Allied troops discovered partially assembled jets hidden in forests and underground facilities, testimony to both the scale of Germany's dispersal efforts and the futility of continuing production in the face of overwhelming defeat. For the engineers and workers who had labored under impossible conditions, the unfinished variants symbolized ambitions cut short by the realities of war. Ultimately, the He-162 never progressed beyond being a rushed, unstable interceptor. The proposed upgrades, heavier armament, better engines, improved stability, might have addressed some of its flaws, but by the spring of 1945 there was no time, no resources, and no trained personnel left to bring these concepts to fruition. The variants stand as reminders of what German designers hoped to achieve, but also of the disconnect between technological ambition and the crumbling reality of the Third Reich's final months. When the war ended in May 1945, dozens of intact He-162s fell into Allied hands. For the victors, the jet was both a curiosity and a symbol of the extraordinary extremes to which German aviation had been driven in its final months. Engineers from Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and even France quickly seized upon these aircraft for testing, eager to learn what lessons they might provide. Although the He-162 had been a failure in German service, it represented one of the few operational jet fighters in the world at the time, and its examination contributed to the post-war understanding of high-speed flight. In Britain, several captured HUS-162s were shipped to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Test pilots found the jet fast and responsive, but dangerously unstable at low speeds, confirming reports from German sources. They noted its innovative use of an ejection seat, which, while primitive, demonstrated the German commitment to pilot survivability even in such a rushed design. The overall verdict was that the He-162 could never have been a war winner. Its structural weaknesses, short range, and fragile engine made it unsuitable for sustained combat. Still, it provided valuable insight into jet technology and underscored the challenges of producing advanced aircraft under conditions of scarcity. The Americans also conducted extensive evaluations. Several He-162s were shipped to the United States under Operation Lusty, the program dedicated to capturing and studying German aviation technology. At Wright Field, engineers and pilots examined the aircraft's unique layout, particularly the placement of the BMW 003 engine above the fuselage. They concluded that while unconventional, the arrangement had limited potential for future designs due to maintenance difficulties and aerodynamic drawbacks. However, aspects of the He-162's lightweight construction and simplified production influenced American thinking on jet aircraft manufacturing. More importantly, it provided another comparative example alongside the Me-262 and Arado R-234, helping the U.S. consolidate its own jet development programs in the late 1940s. The Soviet Union also acquired He-162s, both captured in Germany and delivered by Allied agreements. Soviet engineers dismantled and studied the jets, comparing them with their own emerging designs such as the Yak-15. While the He-162 did not directly shape Soviet fighters, it provided a cautionary case study of how rushing advanced technology into production could compromise effectiveness. Soviet designers focused instead on building sturdier, more practical jets derived from proven designs, but the He-162 reinforced their understanding of the limitations of late-war German engineering. France, too, briefly tested the He-162. For a country rebuilding its aviation industry after occupation, access to advanced German jets was invaluable. French engineers examined the He-162 alongside other captured types, but ultimately found more lasting value in the Messerschmitt Me-262 and Arado R-234. The He-162's reputation as a fragile emergency fighter limited its influence, though it remained an important artifact of the era. In the decades that followed, the He-162 became a fixture of aviation museums rather than air forces. Surviving examples are displayed today in institutions such as the Imperial War Museum in London, the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, and museums in Germany, Norway, and Canada. These preserved aircraft illustrate both the ingenuity and the desperation of German aviation in the final phase of the war. For historians, they offer a tangible reminder of the extraordinary conditions under which the Luftwaffe sought to stave off defeat. The legacy of the He-162 is complex. It demonstrated how advanced technology could be undermined by poor strategic planning and resource shortages. It highlighted the risks of relying on propaganda over practicality, as the vision of a people's fighter flown by untrained youth was a fantasy with deadly consequences. Yet, at the same time, it also revealed the remarkable ability of engineers to create a functional jet fighter in less than 3 months, a feat that remains impressive in terms of sheer speed of development. Today, the He-162 stands less as an example of success than as a cautionary tale, a jet mistake born from desperation, whose legacy lies in its lessons rather than its achievements. The story of the Heinkel He-162 closes with its place in historical memory, where it is often cited as both a technical marvel and a tragic misstep. Unlike the Me-262, which influenced jet development worldwide, the He-162 remained a symbol of Germany's collapse, a machine designed with brilliance but executed under impossible conditions. Its legacy is therefore less about what it accomplished in combat, and more about what it represents in the narrative of the Second World War. From a technological perspective, the He-162 contributed several innovations that resonated beyond the war. The use of an ejection seat as standard equipment was pioneering, even if it was born of necessity given the jet's instability and the high likelihood of accidents. The lightweight construction, reliance on non-strategic materials, and attempts at modular production foreshadowed methods that would be refined in the aerospace industry decades later. Engineers and historians alike recognize that the He-162 embodied both the ingenuity and the futility of wartime improvisation. It pushed the boundaries of what could be built quickly, but in doing so, it highlighted the dangers of prioritizing speed over reliability. Culturally, the He-162 also carried symbolic weight. In Nazi propaganda, it was portrayed as the Volksjäger, the people's fighter, a weapon that would allow Germany's youth to rise against overwhelming odds. In reality, it became a cruel irony. Those same youths, often barely trained, faced a machine that demanded skills they did not have, and punished errors with death. Survivors of JG-1 and other units later recalled their frustration and sorrow, knowing they were asked to fight impossible battles with a weapon unsuited to the task. For them, the jet was less a wonder weapon than a coffin in the sky. The Allies, meanwhile, saw the He-162 as a cautionary example. Post-war evaluations consistently concluded that the aircraft was a product of desperation rather than sound planning. It was studied, dissected, and then relegated to history's margins, overshadowed by the Me-262 and other German jets that had at least shown combat effectiveness. Yet in museums and books, the He-162 endures as a striking artifact, a jet that looked futuristic but whose flaws were as plain as its rushed construction. In broader military doctrine, the He-162 underscored the importance of aligning technology with strategy. It revealed that no matter how advanced an aircraft might appear, it cannot succeed without trained pilots, reliable engines, and a coherent plan for deployment. The Luftwaffe's attempt to mass-produce a jet for barely trained teenagers was not only unrealistic but strategically absurd in the face of Allied numerical superiority. Historians today view it as a lesson in the dangers of letting political ideology dictate weapons development. The push for a people's fighter was less about military necessity and more about maintaining the illusion of hope as the Reich collapsed. In the decades since, the He-162 has also become part of a wider discussion about late-war German technology, often romanticized in popular culture. Alongside projects like the Me-262 V2 rocket and experimental designs such as flying wings, it is sometimes cited as evidence of a technological lead squandered by poor strategy and overwhelming opposition. But serious scholarship has tempered such narratives, emphasizing that many of these so-called wonder weapons were impractical or premature, their promise exaggerated by both Nazi propaganda and post-war fascination with German engineering. Ultimately, the He-162 is remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it symbolizes. It stands as a reminder of a nation's desperation, the cost of rushing unproven designs into combat, and the human lives lost in the process. Today, preserved examples in museums serve as silent witnesses to this history, their small frames and ungainly engine mounts reflecting both the ingenuity and the futility of their creation. In the final tally of World War II aviation, the He-162 was less a revolution than a cautionary tale. Germany's jet mistake, a machine that promised salvation but delivered little more than tragedy. The unseen chapters of the He-162 story lie not only in its operational shortcomings, but also in the forgotten projects and experimental uses that never progressed beyond concept or prototype. In the chaos of the war's final months, German engineers produced a stream of proposals for how the Volksjäger might be adapted to fulfill roles beyond simple interception. But almost all of these plans dissolved with the collapse of the Reich. They reveal, however, the depth of German desperation and the willingness to consider even the most impractical solutions in the hope of turning the tide. One such proposal was to adapt the He-162 into a rocket-assisted point defense interceptor. Engineers considered fitting the aircraft with small rocket boosters to allow rapid climbs directly into bomber formations. In theory, this would have compensated for its limited engine power and short endurance, giving pilots a chance to reach high-altitude bombers quickly. But in practice, the fragile structure and lack of suitable materials made such modifications unworkable. Another idea involved creating a specialized reconnaissance version with cameras in place of armament, but this too was abandoned, as the He-162's range was far too short for meaningful reconnaissance missions. Concepts for night fighter variants also surfaced, though the lack of radar and the cramped cockpit meant they could never have been viable. Among the more unusual plans was the notion of using the He-162 as a parasite fighter, carried aloft by larger bombers and released to attack enemy formations. This idea reflected the influence of earlier German experiments with parasite aircraft, but the logistics of such a program in 1945 were beyond the Luftwaffe's capabilities. Likewise, sketches were drawn for a navalized He-162, imagined as a jet that could be deployed from carriers or coastal bases. By this point, however, the Kriegsmarine had no functioning carriers, and German naval aviation was virtually non-existent. These projects highlight how disconnected many late war concepts were from the material realities of Germany's collapsing war effort. Beyond technical proposals, there were also forgotten operational episodes. A small number of He-162s were captured intact by advancing Allied troops on airfields before they ever flew in combat. In some cases, these aircraft were found hidden in forests or dispersed workshops, part of the German strategy to conceal production from bombing raids. At Lech, where JG-1 had been stationed, Allied investigators discovered dozens of incomplete airframes, some only days away from flight readiness, others little more than skeletons of wood and metal. The sheer number of partially built machines testifies to the ambition of the program and its futility. Germany hoped to field thousands, but the war ended with only a few hundred ever leaving the factory floor. For the pilots who flew it, the He-162's unseen story was one of constant risk and fleeting success. Some recalled that when everything functioned perfectly, the jet could deliver exhilarating performance, briefly putting them on equal footing with Allied fighters. But more often, the aircraft betrayed them. Failures of glue, flameouts of the engine, or collapses of the landing gear turned routine flights into fatal missions. Post-war interviews with JG-1 veterans paint a picture of a weapon that inspired both awe and dread. They recognized its speed and agility, but also knew it was unfit for the role it had been designed to fill. In historical reflection, the He-162's forgotten missions and abandoned projects serve as reminders of what happens when technology is driven by ideology rather than strategy. Each variant sketched on paper, each incomplete fuselage left in a forest workshop, represents time, effort, and lives diverted into a weapon that could not alter the course of the war. Today, these unseen chapters deepen the aircraft's legacy as not merely a flawed machine, but as a case study in desperation. An advanced jet that came too late, too flawed, and too poorly conceived to be anything more than a footnote in the history of aerial warfare. The final dimension of the He-162's story lies in the way it was remembered, studied, and contextualized in the years after the war. For aviation historians, it quickly became a subject of fascination, often mentioned alongside the Me-262 and Arado R-234 as one of the remarkable examples of German jet experimentation. Yet its role was very different. While the Me-262 had at least demonstrated real combat power, the He-162 was recognized as an emergency machine, an aircraft whose very existence revealed more about the state of the Third Reich than about the future of aviation. Its place in post-war discourse was shaped less by what it achieved in 1945 and more by what it symbolized. In the immediate post-war period, the Allies displayed captured He-162s in air shows and exhibitions, presenting them as trophies of victory over Nazi Germany's technological ambitions. For the public, the strange-looking jet, with its engine perched above the fuselage, appeared futuristic, a glimpse of the weapons that might have threatened the skies had the war continued longer. But aviation professionals were far more critical. Reports from Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union all concluded that the jet's structural weaknesses and poor endurance made it unsuitable for sustained operations. Rather than a revolution, the He-162 was assessed as a rushed experiment, impressive only for the speed of its development. Over time, the He-162 acquired a reputation as a lesson learned. Military planners studying its design highlighted the dangers of compressing development cycles and sacrificing reliability for political or propaganda goals. The idea that barely trained Hitler Youth could operate a cutting-edge jet fighter was exposed as a fantasy, one that wasted valuable resources at a time when Germany could least afford it. For air forces entering the jet age after 1945, the He-162 became an example of what not to do. Emphasis shifted toward training, reliability, and integration into larger strategic frameworks, lessons that influenced NATO and Warsaw Pact air forces alike as they built their first generations of jet fighters. In historical literature, the He-162 is frequently used as a symbol of the collapse of rational strategy within Nazi Germany. Writers emphasize the contrast between the ingenuity of German engineers and the irrational demands placed upon them by political leaders. The fact that Heinkel's team produced a flying prototype in just 90 days remains extraordinary, but it is almost always followed by the reminder that haste doomed the aircraft's effectiveness. The narrative of the Volksjäger, meant to embody the people's will to resist, instead became one of wasted lives and futile gestures in the face of inevitable defeat. Cultural memory has also played a role in how the He-162 is perceived today. In films, documentaries, and popular books, it often appears as part of the mythology of Germany's wonder weapons, grouped with rockets and experimental jets that seem decades ahead of their time. But unlike the V-2 or the Me-262, the He-162 lacked both scale and effectiveness. Its presence in this mythology is more about its appearance and symbolism than its combat value. Aviation enthusiasts and museum visitors are still drawn to its sleek lines and unusual engine placement, but the accompanying placards almost always note the grim irony of its design, a jet built for youth pilots who never had a chance to master it. Thus, the He-162's legacy straddles two worlds. On the one hand, a testament to engineering under pressure. On the other, a cautionary tale about desperation, propaganda, and misplaced priorities. It never shaped the course of the war, nor did it influence the design of post-war jets in any direct way. Instead, its importance lies in its story. The jet that came too late, too flawed, and too fragile, remembered less for victories than for what it revealed about a regime in collapse. For historians and enthusiasts alike, the He-162 endures as a small but telling fragment of the larger history of World War II aviation, Germany's jet mistake, preserved in museums as a warning from the past. The closing chapter of the Heinkel He-162's story underscores its role as one of the most vivid symbols of the futility of Germany's late-war weapons programs. Conceived as a revolutionary people's fighter, it emerged instead as a machine defined by compromise, fragility, and desperation. Its design highlighted both the brilliance of German engineers and the impossibility of producing effective advanced aircraft under the conditions of 1944-1945. By the time it reached squadrons, the Luftwaffe was already broken, the Reich surrounded, and the Allies dominant in the skies. The He-162 was never given the chance to prove itself in large numbers, and even if it had been, its flaws were too great to overcome. In retrospect, the He-162 was less about fighting the war and more about prolonging the illusion of resistance. Nazi propaganda presented it as a wonder weapon that would empower the German people to strike back, but its actual record was one of accidents, attrition, and a handful of isolated engagements. Pilots who flew it often praised its speed but condemned its instability, acknowledging that the aircraft killed more of its own than it destroyed in combat. The dream of legions of youth pilots intercepting Allied bombers evaporated in the face of reality. There were no resources, no fuel, and no time left to make such a program possible. The He-162 became a tragic footnote, a symbol of young men sent to die in machines that could never achieve what was promised. For historians, the He-162 remains a case study in the dangers of designing weapons in response to ideology rather than strategy. It was a project that consumed materials and manpower without providing meaningful returns. While its construction speed and innovative features impressed post-war engineers, they did not alter the verdict. The jet was a mistake, born of desperation and doomed by circumstance. In this sense, the He-162 stands in sharp contrast to the Me-262, which, despite its own limitations, demonstrated the real potential of jet warfare. The Volksjäger, by comparison, embodied the collapse of rational planning in a regime on the brink of destruction, today surviving. He-162s rest quietly in museums, their small frames preserved as relics of a war that pushed technology to its limits. Visitors who see them often remark on their compact size and strange engine placement, rarely realizing the immense hopes once pinned upon them. In these preserved airframes lies a paradox, a machine that looked advanced and futuristic, yet was fatally compromised from the moment it was conceived. They serve as reminders not of victory or technological triumph, but of the human cost of desperation, of engineers forced to cut corners, pilots asked to risk their lives in unstable aircraft, and a nation that sacrificed its youth for illusions of salvation. The He-162 is remembered ultimately not for what it did, but for what it failed to do. It could not defend Germany, it could not alter the balance of the skies, and it could not change the outcome of the war. What it left behind was a warning that speed of development cannot replace sound design, that propaganda cannot substitute for strategy, and that technological brilliance is meaningless when deployed in the service of a doomed cause. As such, the He-162's place in history is secure, not as a war-winning fighter, but as Germany's jet mistake, a relic of collapse, and a lesson carried forward into the jet age that followed.